One microphone, okay. Well, thank you all for coming today on this beautiful sunny summer Sunday. Appreciate your attendance. Today's subject, as Victor announced, is going to be on addiction and recovery, with the emphasis on recovery, although it's going to be inclusive of addiction. We're going to try to stay to substance abuse and dependency, not talking about the other addictions because there just isn't enough time in what's provided for us today to talk about other compulsive behaviors, addictions. So I want to welcome you all and give you a little bit of background before I introduce my very esteemed, distinguished panel members who are willing to participate and share what they know about addiction and recovery. This series began very serendipitously. I had presented the book signing of my book that came out in June of this year, June 2014, Why Did She Jump? My Daughter's Battle with Bipolar Disorder. And much to my chagrin, my surprise, we had an audience that was standing room only. And I didn't realize how many people were dealing with the subject of mental illness. And when I realized it because of the crowd, I asked how many people in here either have or know someone who has some kind of a mental illness or disorder. And I couldn't believe it, but every hand went up. And there were over 100 people here. So I think Books and Books realized that there was a very strong need to be able to be a sponsor in giving an opportunity for the community to learn about mental illness and disorders. And so she approached me. I'm a clinical social worker in private practice in Hollandale and Fort Lauderdale. And she asked me if I could create something that would be an opportunity for this adventure or this to happen. So I came up with the idea of a panel with giving 4 different perspectives. The perspective of a psychiatrist, a counselor, a person who's suffering from whatever we're going to be talking about today. It would be an addiction. Last time it was depression and anxiety. The time before that it was bipolar and suicide. So this became a series, and I'm very grateful to Books and Books for giving me this opportunity to give the opportunity to all of you. So today's subject, addiction and recovery, is something that is pretty pervasive in, I'm talking about our culture. It's actually global. But just in our culture, I'm going to give you a little bit of statistics, not to bore you, but just to give you an idea of how pervasive and how rampant this is. First of all, the costs and consequences of alcoholism and drug dependence place an enormous burden on our society. And it's the nation's #1 health problem. Addiction strains the economy, the healthcare system, the criminal justice system, and threatens job security, public safety, marriage, and family life. It crosses all societies, all boundaries, and affects every ethnic group, both genders, and people in every tax bracket. Today, however, Americans increasingly recognize addiction as a disease that can be treated. The scope is amazing. It's just huge. Alcohol, this comes from the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependency, and it could be old. I don't know when it was done, so it could be, this may not be exactly the way it is, but it'll give you an idea. Commonly used substance, alcohol is the most commonly used addictive substance in the United States, where about 18 million people, or 1 in every 12 adults, suffer from alcohol abuse or dependence, along with several million more who engage in risky drinking patterns that could lead to alcohol problems. More than half of all adults have a family history of alcoholism or problem drinking, and more than 7 million children live in a household where at least one parent is dependent or has abused alcohol. Drug dependence, according to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, an estimated 20 million Americans aged 12 years old or older used an illegal drug in the past 30 days. The estimate represents 8% of the population aged 12 years old or older. Additionally, the non-medical use or abuse of prescription drugs, including painkillers, sedatives, and stimulants, is growing with an estimated 48 million people ages 12 and older using prescription drugs for non-medical reasons. And this represents about 20% of the United States. So that is a wide scope, and that was why I thought this would be a very relevant and very important discussion to have today. So without further ado, what I want to do is I do want to tell you that I do not deal myself with first stage recovery. I pass it on to these folks here. My practice is primarily second stage recovery, which really is about folks who have gone through program and who have been clean and sober for at least 2 to 3 months, because when somebody is using, they cannot do the kind of work that I provide, which is highly experiential. They really have to be clean and sober for some time. So this is my wonderfully esteemed panel. This is first Dr. Christopher Lariche, who is the medical director of Lucida, which is in Lantana, Florida here. And you are also an addictionologist and a therapist, as well as a psychiatrist. So we got the whole ball of wax here. And I really appreciate you participating here as you've done before. Next to Dr. Lariche, who is going to give you his deal on addiction and recovery, is Jonathan Benz, who's the program director of the faith-based program called 3 Strands at the Recovery Center. It's a spiritual program as well. And then there is Kathy D., who I've known for many, many years, who is, I don't want to say a recovering addict, I know that's the term, but I want to call her she's in recovery. I'm very careful not to use that word too often, because I don't think people need to be identified like that. So Kathy has volunteered her time to come here and talk about her experience, her hope, and her courage to share with you. And then we have Ganelle Gosselin, who I can't see at the end, who is our family member, and who comes here to speak from true knowledge, because her mother and her son are in addiction, and she lost her mother to alcoholism, liver cirrhosis, and her son is now in recovery. So I would just like to begin by letting Dr. Lariche begin with your information that you want to share. And then afterwards, hold your questions and your comments, if you don't mind, until after we get through with the presentation, and then we'll take your comments and your questions and your participation. I do want to say that we have to use one microphone at a time, like we did at sitting on the table. Right, okay. And, okay, you're on.
Thank you very much. So, thank you for that nice introduction, and Books and Books, thank you for having us here. So my name is Dr. Christopher Lariche. I'm an addiction psychiatrist, a psychotherapist, and a psychiatrist. And I think it's important to note that I'm sitting at the table, but it's not me, Christopher, sitting at the table, but that a physician is sitting at the table, because that really shows that in addiction, things have shifted a little bit. And now there are a lot of addiction physicians. I actually went through a whole extra year of training in a fellowship that was just addiction, where we looked at all sorts of addiction, inpatient, outpatient, withdrawal, severe intoxication, maternal fetal addiction, HIV addiction, and mental health disorders called triple diagnosis, consult and liaison addiction, so going to all the different departments where there was addiction. So it's really a medical specialty now, and it hasn't been for a long, long time, or it hasn't really ever been in this country until just now. What happens if you don't look at addiction through a medical lens? I just came back from Paraguay in South America, and I was at a historic event. I was at the first ever conference on the treatment of addictions in Paraguay. And they're very behind the game, which they're the first to admit. But where are the folks with addiction in that country? I expected to see lots of people in the audience. The audience was packed. There was around 300 people. But when I asked them to raise their hands, all the people there were physicians. 2 people raised their hands. One was the Minister of Health, who sort of had to be there, and the other was a family physician. So most of the people in Paraguay dealing with addiction were from the courts and the prisons and from the Catholic Church. So it was filled with priests and with a lot of lawyers and judges. So if you don't deal with addiction, people end up in prison, and then they end up in whatever safety net there is in that country. It's the Catholic Church. I'll just say a couple more words about addiction. So what is it? What is addiction? According to the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and there are 2 main bodies of addiction, of medical addiction in this country. One is the ASAM, the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and the other is the AAAP, which is the American Academy of Addiction Psychiatry. That one is mine, that I'm a member of. So ASAM, the American Society of Addiction, says addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain circuits, including reward, memory, motivation, and other related circuitry, and that it manifests as uncontrolled or pathological pursuit of reward despite hazardous consequences. And we see this in an array of settings, and not just substances. As Joan mentioned, today we'll just focus on substances because it's such a huge area. Now, things have really, really changed in addiction. And, it kind of went through, we're kind of at the early renaissance of addiction. We're really at, Giotto was painting his first frescoes in Toscana, when this would be kind of the early days of addiction, where finally we have good imaging, which was a huge, huge shift. So finally we have functional imaging in addiction. So we have functional MRIs, and we can actually see that addiction is a circuit problem, a problem in different circuits of the brain. Now, this is where I float into nerd space. I promise I won't do it because I don't have all my charts. So, but we see that it's just so fascinating. It's a problem. It's a disruption of the circuit, which is called the reward circuit, deep in the brain, and just a sec, sorry. And this reward circuit, so when I say reward, what I mean? Feeling, reward, or motivation. So this circuit is implied and implicated in so many different illnesses, not just addiction. It's in an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which is sort of deep and primitive part of the brain that all mammals have in the limbic brain. And we see that you need to be in the kind of sweet spot in terms of the reward system, and too much is pathological and too little is pathological. So if you have too much activation of the reward circuit, you end up having these spikes of it's actually dopamine. I don't really like to put that word out there because people then think, well, I just need more dopamine. Let me go to a store and get dopamine. But I mean, it's a circuit. The way I kind of liken it to a light bulb. So if your light bulb burns out, you don't say, well, I need more electricity. I just need to throw more electricity at it. No, there's something in the circuit that's broken. And if you look carefully, you see the little filament is actually ruptured and the circuit is broken. The same thing is true in the reward circuit in addiction. It is disrupted and you get these spikes of dopamine. But again, don't focus on dopamine. And at a certain point, you can only experience pleasure or reward at these very, very high peaks. In the whole middle end, which is called natural rewards, which is food, sex, having a good conversation with a friend, becomes drowned out, and you no longer experience pleasure in that. So you only get the peaks. But if the reward is too low, if this whole circuit is broken and it's too low, you begin to get depression. There's some very interesting studies done where they stimulate this circuit called the nucleus accumbens with a little electrode in the brain, and people with treatment-resistant depression begin to feel motivated again. They begin to, it was done in Cologne, Germany. They begin to feel like, oh, I want to go bowling, or oh, I want to go visit the Cologne Cathedral for the first time in 10 years. These are treatment-resistant people. There was just a study done, I just read it this morning, they did deep brain stimulation, these electrodes, in someone with anorexia nervosa who did not enjoy eating food. And they got a very positive response from this young woman. She began to be interested in eating food and started to feed herself again and to eat again. So this is really implicated in so many different areas. Again, I don't want to get all biological, but the disease model has really, really changed the way we understand it. And as we go forward in the afternoon, I really want to make a case for, a place that you should go or refer people to that have problems with addictions to their doctor, and go to a doctor. Certainly, it's been dealt with by therapists, and many of us are therapists here, or several of us are, and we can attest to that. But also, as I was just on Tuesday teaching the medical students at FIU here in Florida, here in Miami, about addiction. So there's a new medical model coming out, and that's what I'll be very happy to speak to you today about. So let me push on.
Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Benz, and I'm going to hold this. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. And I always say that I'm very lucky because I get to work with addicts and alcoholics in recovery and see people transform and change their lives. And this is very hard work and very rewarding work as well. I do direct a treatment program at the Recovery Place in Fort Lauderdale. And ours is a faith-based program where we incorporate spirituality into the recovery piece, helping people integrate more meaning and purpose in life, because we find that meaning and purpose are essential for people to stay in recovery. And we know that addiction strips people of a sense of meaning, purpose, fulfillment, even their very identity. So that's the clinical work that we do. I sometimes joke that, I was raised in a very recovery-friendly home up in the Palm Beach area. And growing up, I had some mentors who had been in recovery for years. So for me, addicts and alcoholics were not bad people. It was not a shame to be an alcoholic. It was a disease. And these folks were my mentors, actually. So I was very lucky because my upbringing was I was mentored by people who talked openly about these things. So I guess it's no accident that I fell into this work. And sometimes I say that if people who are really who need their own help either go into psychology or some form of ministry and religious work. Well, I did both. And then I added addictions on top of it, so that means I'm really challenged in life. And but I do think that finding a healthy way to engage not just addiction, but other mental health disorders, because we find that these things they all overlap, and that's what we find in our clinical work. I'm right now going through the process of certification in sex addiction. And we're doing more work in that area because we're finding that as a person's drug of choice leaves, sexual acting out or other behaviors can go up as well. So I know we're focusing on the chemical dependence piece today, but I like what Dr. Lariche said for sort of a new model and emerging of how we treat people with dignity and respect, understanding the neuroscience, because this neuroscience piece is key for a person's healing and recovery. Of course, there are the behaviors, and all of the psycho-emotional elements that we work with, in terms of counseling and bringing healing into a person's life. But I do know that this is a very treatable disease state. I see it every day. I have people in my life, even it was posted on social media, the event here, and I happened to glance down before we started, and a former client who has several years in sobriety was posting about it. That's the kind of stuff that I find very, very enriching, very fulfilling, is that it is possible for people to move into recovery when they have a good understanding of the disease state and also how that plays out in psycho-emotional and spiritual components of their life. So that's me by way of introduction. Okay.
Thank you. Wow. It's really tough. I'm sitting here with such an illustrious crowd. My name is Kathy, and I'm an alcoholic addict. I'm going to just give you a little brief history. I came from an upper middle class family in South Florida. From the outside, everything looked great. I had a bright future. I had great parents, a great upbringing, and I would go to treatment, and they'd say, "Well, if your life was so great, how come you're an addict?" And I'd say, "I don't know. It was not their fault." And I've been in and out of the 12-step fellowships and treatment centers in the South Florida area, from Palm Beach County to the Keys, many times. And what I've put my family through is horrendous. I've been through therapy. I really enjoyed the medical aspect. It's been a long, long time coming. And I'm thrilled I'm honored to be a part of this panel. What happened was I started to get in trouble. As a child, I never felt good enough for my family. And I don't think it was anything they did. My mother gave me every lesson, everything. But there was something inside of me that didn't feel good enough. And the 70s hit, and we tried using drugs and alcohol. And instantly I became a part of something, that 70s revolution. And most of my friends went on, and it was just a thing, a passing phase. It wasn't a passing phase for me. It was years and years and years. And I quit college because it was getting in the way of partying. Usually you stop partying. But, I just couldn't get out of my own way. Today I believe I was really searching for a power greater than myself. I was searching for that spiritual base, something. I just didn't know what it was. I was looking out here somewhere. And recently, I could tell you about horrendous relapse after relapse after relapse. I don't want to go through that. Very recently, I have a little over a year, about a year and a half. My 22-year-old son at the time said to me, "Listen, Mom, I'm not doing this anymore. I'm going away, and when I come back, you're either going to be sober or back in the program, or I'm leaving. I don't care if I have to go to a hotel room. I'm not going to watch my mother die." And I'd like to tell you that it ended that moment. It didn't. It took me about 2 days, and I called my sponsor, and I said, I can't do this anymore. And it was true, because I have journals. I'm a big journal writer. I could barely read my writing, but I didn't relapse for very long. It was maybe a month or so, and but it was really bad, 2 months. And I thought, how bad could it have really been? I had become addicted to so many different chemicals in that short amount of time that for the first 2 weeks, I could barely move. I could barely walk. I could barely move. The pain was ridiculous because it was opiates and it was everything, and alcohol on top of it. And but I didn't want to lose my kid. I really didn't. And I knew I was going to die. I used to come back when I was young, and it was okay, and you bounce right back. I wasn't bouncing back. And I think it was the first time that I really came to the conclusion that, this might kill me. Because somewhere in the back of, I think, most of our minds is, it might kill you, but it's not really going to kill me. I know that's how I felt. I could look at you and really tell you, like, you needed the program, but, I could take it or leave it. Somewhere in my sick mind, I knew I had a problem, and I knew that it was I just didn't believe it would kill me. And at that point, I had had enough. I had emotionally had enough. And I think that's where we as people in recovery need to get to. It's very unfortunate, and I'm sure for the other people on this panel, including family members, that must be the toughest thing to watch, because I see it in another family member, and I'm watching it from the other side, and it's horrible to watch somebody not be able to get out of their own way. But once we get out of our own way, it's like, look out, because here we come. Because it's a wonderful, wonderful life. To think that I just didn't want to do anything. And now, at 57 years old, I just lost my mother a couple weeks ago. And I can tell you that I'm at peace with it, because I got to take care of her the last 10 years. And even in spite of the relapse, I didn't have that shame and guilt of never being able to make amends with my mother. I promised her, I was always saying, I'm going to go back to school. I'm going to go back to school. I can't tell you how many times I had this conversation with Joan. And I actually registered last week. I'm starting school. I'm going back to school. You know, and I'm thrilled. It's life is grand. You know, I have a power greater than myself that I can tap into at any given moment. When that little voice in my head says, you're not good enough, it's not right enough, somebody will say to me, you're going to go to school? Isn't that a lot of math and science? And that little voice will want to hang on to that instead of the excitement I have about going back. But I've learned so many things along the way that I have two choices to make. I either listen to the nightmare voice or I listen to the God-inspired voice. And today I'm choosing the positive way. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ganelle, and as was mentioned, I'm a family member. My mother passed away from cirrhosis due to alcoholism when I was only 15 years old, so I did have to spend 2 very formative years of my childhood, from about 13 to 15, watching my mother die. Her alcoholism is not the most important thing about her. I think everyone should know that the year I was born, 1968, my mother was named Outstanding Woman of the Year for Mississippi. She was socially very active in the community. She had taken on the Mississippi Dairy Commission because they were price fixing, and got our women's club on it and won. She started art shows. The little town of Ocean Springs, Mississippi is now this cute little artsy town. It's a couple of towns over from the town we were in, which was very industrial. It's because she and her women did things like put on art festivals, even in spite of, within a month or 2 before she died, she had put on, her big baby was the Clothesline Art Show, where every single child in our county was able to put up a piece of artwork. And this was every public school, every private art studio. And it was almost as if that was her swan song before she died. She waited until that thing was up, and then she said, get me to the hospital. So though she was able to do these wonderful things in the community, she still had a deep pain inside herself that none of us could help. And I'm afraid it really was hell at home. And I did experience a lot of emotional abuse, not just from watching the dying, but watching every time that anybody tried to interfere with the drinking. She was vicious with us all. And I am lucky. 4 of my 5 siblings have struggled with some degree of a substance use disorder, ranging from a raging crack addiction to binge drinking, and I managed to escape that. I don't think it's because I don't have that tendency. I think it's really because I had buffers in the community. I had teachers, I had church people, I had my dance teacher, and this community of people that came around and were able to do for me what my mother could not. And that gave me a tremendous amount of resilience. I also had the performing arts, so I was able to find a creative expression for the sorrow, for the things that at the time I thought couldn't be said, things I thought I was alone in. And with the dancing, I challenge anybody here to stay angry or stay sad when you're wagging your tail. Sorry, I don't think it can be done. So I learned that feelings are not final. And to some degree, that pushed me. I became a somatic educator, which is just a fancy word for I work with mind, body, issues. Everybody has mind, everybody has body. I teach people how to use theirs better. And yet, in spite of the resilience, when my son was 13, I found out the family disease had him in its sights. In the same day, I remember it clear as a bell because it was my husband's 49th birthday, I discovered my son was smoking marijuana. He was only 13. And not only did I discover it, because I was able to keep my cool, thank goodness for the angel who talked me down, I was able to ask questions. When I confronted him, I remember saying, your school conducts random drug tests. If they gave you one tomorrow, would you be able to pass? And he looked this way and that way and the other. And he finally looked at me and said no. And I kept asking questions about, what does he have in the house? And found out a lot of things that made me quickly put several things together. He had developed substance use disorder right under my nose. And believe you me, having grown up the way I grew up, I knew it for what it was, and I had been on the lookout for it. I still missed it. He'd started drinking when he was 12, but he was clever. He kept it over at the neighbor's house. So when I heard he'd thrown up the night before, I scolded him for eating too much junk food. And he'd been wearing a little too much cologne. I thought he was trying to impress girls. The way I discovered it was that it had escalated to the point that he started using at home, started using alone. And when I asked him how he was paying for it, he actually showed me a stash. I said, "This stuff isn't free. How'd you pay for it?" "Well, I was stealing." At the time, I'd noticed things going missing, but to tell you the God's honest truth, I am really scatterbrained, and I was starting to worry I had early onset Alzheimer's. So to find out he was stealing, this was a kid who had been honest as the day is long, and I knew right then and there, oh my God, this is a problem. Within a couple of days, he ended up being expelled from school. Actually, suspended from school. Within about 2 weeks, he was expelled from school. And while I was trying to get the assessment, he got arrested. When I had the assessment done, I found out it was worse than I had thought. Now, my son had also broken his arm pretty severely the summer before and had been given a legitimate prescription for Vicodin. And we're talking like long arm cast for 6 months kind of fracture. He told me later, Florida being the pill mill capital of the world, I knew you could use this stuff to get high. And he did. When he came out of that assessment, the counselor said, "I am really hesitant to send a child as young as yours to inpatient treatment, but I'm afraid if you don't, you're going to come home and find him blue." So I did. You didn't have to twist my arm. And that was the first of what is now 3 interventions. My son has been in 3 treatment centers and 1 long-term residential program. His periods of sobriety have included a 2-year period of sobriety from age 14 to 16, 17. Unfortunately, last summer he experienced a relapse and has been in treatment and was released about 2 months ago and is still sober. Now, one of the things that moms deal with is we get mom shamed. The first time my son had been in treatment, the neighbors, one of them told me, "Oh, your son isn't an addict. Addicts are the scum of the earth." And she tried to discourage me and criticized me, actually, for putting my son in treatment. Because they get in there with all the bad kids and they learn from each other and it only makes them worse. And I really want to encourage other parents that it is our job. It is our job to do what needs to be done, regardless of what critics and naysayers say. And one of the choices I was, quite frankly, unwilling to make was to live without my son. And my son was an overdose waiting to happen. Because of early and sustained intervention, and right now my son sees outpatient therapists 3 times a week and is required, his school took him back, but he's required to go to meetings and to check in with somebody every day. Because of sustained intervention, he's had a chance for his brain to mature. He has had relatively little damage from the substances he used, which I also didn't mention. He went into synthetics in one of those periods and nearly died from a seizure. He has had a chance to heal. And unfortunately, the reality, as I understand it, is most families, most 90% of addictions start in the teen years. 50% of them before kids even have a driver's license. Mm-hmm. And most parents in my situation will let something go 5 to 7 years before stepping in. I think that's really unacceptable, and I want to encourage. Now, it's a lot of work to to navigate the system, but I also work with some organizations, one of them called the Addict's Mom, and you can find that on addictsmom.com. We're a group of mothers who advocate on behalf of our children, who share information and are working to get better treatment for our children. And I also work as part of the Recovery Awareness Partnership in Palm Beach County to strip away the stigma from the illness. You know, if 20-something million people have this, they all have moms. And when I figured that out, I laughed out loud and said, why did I ever think I was alone? And who do we think we're fooling? Because it wasn't just my mother, it wasn't just my kid, it's probably your aunt and your kid and your cousin. And it really is everybody's problem. And I just encourage people to talk about the elephant in the room because, I'll leave you with my favorite quote from Tennessee Williams. Silence about a thing magnifies it. It festers. It grows malignant in silence. Mm-hmm.
And we can all pitch in now, and we have about 20 minutes left. If you want to add to what we've already said, please do. You're fine.
I can just jump in on what Kathy and first of all, thank you both for being so open with your lives in the service of this day. I mean, it's easy for me to just hide behind the facts and everything, but you all are coming out and actually, it means a lot. So thank you. I really acknowledge you both for that. In something in what both of you said, Kathy, when you were talking about the good voice and the bad voice, and Ganelle, when you were talking about the child's brain is still developing, and that's very much the case. Most addictions actually, and when I use addiction today, I'll use for substance dependence. Most addictions actually, they have some exposure to an addictive substance in the adolescent years before the brain is fully developed. So the front part of the brain, is, a lot of you might know, is called the prefrontal cortex, and this is the seat of all the executive functions, importantly of decision making, of impulse control, of denial of gratification, of reasoning, of thinking about consequences. And it never really comes into full development until the early 20s. So what kind of puts the brakes on everything in our lower structures of craving, reward, what feels good, keep doing it, is our higher structures up here, and they never are fully developed until the early 20s. So the good voice and the bad voice, the good voice is saying, well, hang on a minute, think about this. Do I really want to go and do that? It might have a lot of consequences. And the bad voice says, hey, let's do it. It feels good. So what we're really talking about is the neocortex, the front part or the outer part of our brain, and specifically the frontal lobe, versus, I love how Dan Siegel, I don't know if you know Dan Siegel at UCLA, he says, the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. Mm-hmm. And he talks about the upstairs brain is the prefrontal cortex, and the downstairs brain is the limbic brain and the brainstem, which give us impulse and control, impulse and desire and craving. So you have to the upstairs brain puts brakes on the downstairs brain, as it were. And that's what you were able to do, Kathy, and that's what so many young people are unable to do because it's not fully developed. And sometimes when all of my patients, I'm the addiction psychiatrist, medical director, for those of you that came later, medical director at Lucida up near in Lantana, Florida, in Palm Beach County, and an addiction psychiatrist. And all of my patients know the brain. They know the brain circuits. And make sure they know it so they really understand. And that can be hugely empowering and also destigmatizing for them to understand what's going on with their brain. One other important thing, and this Dr. Benz can speak to, is really addiction. There's a real genetic component, and there are addictions fast and addictions slow. The slowest addiction, really, of substances is alcohol. It takes a number of years to actually, at the fastest, a number of years to actually fully develop. The quickest addictions are the stimulants. So cocaine, crack is very fast, and the faster forms of amphetamine, methamphetamine, is very, very fast. These are very rapid addictions. Now, just moving on the more biological level, we know that addiction is. How do we know this is a brain disease? How do we know this? We know it because we can create any substance dependence, any addiction in a mouse or a rat that we can create in a human being. Any chemical a human can get addicted to, or a mouse or a rat can get addicted to. Now watch this. You get a mouse addicted to cocaine, and they press a lever, till they get cocaine directly into their central nervous system, and they will keep pressing that lever, getting the cocaine, until they fall over dead. Prostration out of dehydration and hunger, and there's food right next to them. The only way to cure that rat is to take him out of the cage and change the cage. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, changing the cage is the environment. So we have to change the environment, and we know now that addiction is both genetically determined from our genes, and also very much so from what happens to us after our genes are set and our chromosome is set in our brains. So the environment, especially early life, is a big, and both of you mentioned early life, it's a very big determinant of susceptibility to addiction, but certainly not. Many people have wonderful early lives and still have addiction. So there's genetic, and then there's the environment. Just going back to our mouse or a rat, so we get a rat addicted to cocaine, and we look in the mouse's or rat's brain. We cut it open, and we look at, there are predictably 2 spots of change in the brain. 2 spots, no matter what the substance. One is in the brainstem, the other is in the limbic system, called the VTA and the nucleus accumbens. Always these same 2 spots are altered. This is what sets up the reward system. You look at a human being's brain, you put them in a functional MRI, who's addicted to whatever substance the mouse or the rat is addicted to, and you see the same 2 spots of change in the human being's brain. The same 2 spots across species and across substances. So you can change the substance, you can change the animal, and you still get the same change in brain circuitry. I mean, that's sort of incontrovertible evidence that it's a brain disease, because it manifests as the same thing. It manifests as, think of that little rat that kept pressing the lever, he didn't eat or drink, as the pathological pursuit of reward. So keep searching for that little spurt of cocaine until you die. So the other important part, and this, I'm sure Dr. Benz can speak to, is there are certain personality traits as well, which confer a vulnerability to us for addiction. And some of those are character traits that don't necessarily change over the course of your life. And some of them can be things that you can learn, capabilities and skills you can learn. We spend a lot of time doing that at Lucida with our patients. There are also medications that you can use which are antagonists, which are blockers of this circuit. So you all have probably heard of one, it's not actually an antagonist, but you've probably heard of Antabuse. Most people have heard of Antabuse, which is the medicine you take for alcohol dependence. It makes you vomit if you drink alcohol. It makes you red in the face and flushed. That's called aversive treatment. But there's antagonist treatment, which actually goes to the deep part of the brain, the nucleus accumbens, and it blocks one type of receptor called the mu-opiate receptor. It's a very old medication. President Nixon was the one who funded a lot of money for this because he thought it would be a cure for opiate dependence, and actually it is. But one of the most interesting things about this, it's a medication called naltrexone, is that when it's given to people, it cools down this compulsive circuit in the brain that proves useful for alcohol dependence, for opiate dependence, for a lot of other compulsive behaviors, pathological gambling. It actually decreases gambling. It decreases binge eating. It decreases cutting, people that cut for relief. So this also went right to the heart of, well, hang on a minute, we're dealing with a circuit that tends to be related because it's the pathological pursuit of reward. We found that, and here's where I bring out my little circuit, but all of my patients know this, that there is a shared neural circuit for reward. It's the shared pathway, and all the different drugs of abuse flow into this pathway. They all have different intoxicating effects, so getting intoxicated with alcohol is different from getting intoxicated with cocaine, which is different from getting intoxicated with opiates, but they all converge on the same pathway deep, deep in the brain. This is the pathway of reward between the brainstem and the nucleus accumbens. This is the pathway that really needs to cool down. And you can do it with medication. Medication I'm a big proponent of, and I know the recovery places as well, is called Vivitrol, which is the long-term injectable form of naltrexone, which is the blocker of this receptor in the middle of the brain. It's called Vivitrol. It was very, very expensive, but we got it covered by insurances, and now you get 1 month injection. So you get one injection a month, and it lasts for a whole month, and it decreases cravings, it decreases relapse for alcohol and opiates. And it's also very useful for, again, gambling and binge eating. So that kind of goes to the heart of the some of the things in the biological view of addiction. I'll just pass it on. I'm sure Dr. Ben has a bunch of things to say about the other aspects.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up naltrexone and Vivitrol. We see for our clients who are in treatment, it's amazing to me because once they go on these medications, it's fast. They say, my cravings are gone. And so, we know that medications are important for the brain to heal, for the individual to heal. So we're very pro medicine, but we're also pro psychotherapy as well. And I like something that Kathy said about sort of the consequences, that there were many consequences, but it took even the consequence of your son saying, I'm not coming back, still took you 2 days. Yeah. But one thing that we do know from from a behavioral standpoint, that the disease of addiction does at some point in most people respond to consequences. And when the consequences are severe enough, that's when the person begins to wake up, as it were, and to realize, I really do have a problem. Because it's almost like the addicted mind is lying to them all the time, saying, I'm okay. And the consequences are the evidence to say, no, you're not, there's something wrong. And so that's what we utilize in helping sort of expedite a person into the recovery process. I think it was Carl Jung who wrote that addicts are frustrated mystics, waylaid by spirits. And I love that because that's what we see. And there's something else that Kathy and that I heard coming through you as well, Ganel. When you all were sharing your stories, that one of you said life is grand, and there's this creative outlet, and there's something bigger, a higher power. There's a bigger story I can participate now in life, and I can be connected to people, and that's that frustrated mystic part, I think. It's that thing that says there are these intangibles, there are these invisible elements like love and hope and serenity and all these different principles that someone can tie into and can bring a much greater, higher level of fulfillment in their lives. And that's what we find that really keeps people in recovery. Otherwise, they're just, we use the term, they're just a dry drunk. And sometimes we say, you're as angry now without alcohol as you were when you were drinking. What is the change? What is the awakening that this individual has to go through so that they just aren't biologically free from that compulsion to use, but also that their mind is free, that their heart is free, that their spirit can soar. We use these different terms, I think oftentimes describing different aspects of the same thing. And so we find that these elements are crucial. So whether we're using, some form of CBT therapy or, cognitive behavioral or whatever the modality is, teaching the individual resilience, even shame resilience. We use a lot of Daring Way and Brene Brown's work, which I'm certified in as well, which is very helpful. And I know we're probably running short on time now, Joan.
We have a few minutes.
But I will say that you as well mentioned the shame component and the guilt and shame. And I do believe, and I see it in the work that I've done over the years, that shame is probably the biggest trigger for relapse, at least in my experience. And shame is that quality that when we just don't like who we are at all and we can't live with it. And shame is a universal experience. We all have it, but we all cope with it and deal with it in different ways. For the addict and alcoholic, when they feel the shame, they're going to use that substance to numb it out. And I think therein lies the difference for that disease state in the brain. And then you have the limbic system and the rewards centers and all of this, and then the prefrontal cortex being shut down and they can't make decisions. It's just, this is why you say to the person, "What's wrong with you? Why won't you stop? Why can't you stop?" And they go, "I don't know, I can't." And when they say that, they're not lying. They're not being difficult. They really can't stop because their brain won't let them. So if we understand that all human behavior, there's a reason for it. It might be genetic. It might be something in the brain. It might be some other motivation within the person. But if we can understand what the reasons are, why people do what they do, especially in addiction, I find it gives us a lot more compassion and empathy and a lot more patience just to help, sort of walk on their journey with them. And I'll say one more thing, that it is a journey. It is a journey. And so it's how we partner with people on that journey in their healing and their recovery that I think also makes the difference. Yes.
I just want to say thank you to both of you and you too, because when I look at how I was, I don't know how anyone of you can tolerate us as active in our active addiction, because we are not pretty, we're not pleasant, we're miserable. I mean, I can say that today, but in my active addiction, you couldn't tell me that. You really couldn't. I knew it all. I wasn't aware of that at the time, but looking back, I can say that. And my heart really bleeds for so many addicts that are so filled with shame they don't get help, and so many family members that are so caught up in the shame, and children that are involved. The staggering numbers of children were just so dramatic for me. But I want to thank you all for your patience with us.
I could say one more thing too. One of the things that was one of the earliest things that was brought to my attention when my son was in his first round of treatment was the importance of the family getting help too, because the stress of the disease, as if I didn't know it, shares the love. And what I realized was that no, I didn't cause the disease. Yes, I could contribute to it for good or for ill. And that if I did not take care of what the stress was doing to me, I would actually cause my son harm. So I went on a journey of healing for myself. I did some EMDR to deal with the trauma of my childhood. I got into a 12-step group for families of addicted loved ones. And that has been, and I developed a good social network so that when I'm feeling kind of crazy, I can reach out, not pull in. I can't stress too much the importance of that, because I knew that my son would have a harder time getting well if I stayed sick. I didn't know if he'd get better, but I knew he would have a hard time if I stayed where I was. And I'm happy to say that as I got better, my whole family came along for the ride. And even this last relapse, boy, that wasn't where we were 3 years ago. It wasn't, it still had its stressful bits and moments, and I don't want to minimize that. but it's nowhere where we were 3 years ago.
Okay, so I have a few things to say also, but we're probably at the closing of the live streaming, and I'm going to open up the audience for your questions, for your comments, but there's just a few things I want to say first. I really appreciate the biological neuroscience piece in here, because as a therapist, I'm dealing mostly with the psychological and the shame, I mean, the shame is the bottom line for sure. We do a lot of shame reduction work, a lot of experiential work. In my own life, in my own family, it's interesting to listen to you, Ganelle, and to you too, Kathy, because you both described yourselves as coming, at least for you, Ganelle, in your generation, with raising your son, you were very alert to the possibilities and the predictabilities because of what you came through. Kathy, you started out by saying that I came from a really good family, upper middle class or middle class. I had 5 children. Coming from being the mother of the 5 children, they came from a very fractured family. Their father was an inveterate gambler. We were divorced after 13 years with 5 children from the ages of 3 to 11. I had to go back to school to support them to get my graduate degree. I worked 3 jobs and went to graduate school. I did anything that I could to pay the rent or pay the mortgage, Florida Power and Light. But from a 7-year-old or a 10-year-old's mind, they don't understand what Florida Power and Light is. They don't understand what mortgage payments are. So basically, I abandoned my children. Their father lost his license to practice medicine in the state of Florida, had to go away for 7 years. To support that gambling because he had to create a way of supporting that habit. So their father was away. I was at work. Literally, you could say I abandoned my children for reasons that they wouldn't understand. Because from a child's point of view, mommy isn't home when they get home from school. They had every reason in the book to become addicted to substance. Out of the 5 children, not a single child of mine ever became addicted to a substance abuse or a substance, alcohol or drugs. That was a miracle. I always felt, people said, how did you manage? Because our whole neighborhood, they were all born in the 60s, and they grew up in the 70s and the 80s. The entire neighborhood was addicted. I mean, there wasn't a person in the street that didn't have a drug addiction or an alcohol problem. How my kids escaped that hatch, I'll never know. Now, one of them did have bipolar 1 disorder, and she did end up losing her life due to it, but she never took a drug. It was one toke of marijuana that she had never taken in her life that precipitated a psychotic episode. That was the beginning of the discovery that she had something underneath her behavior that came out and was eventually, after many, many, many years, as we talked about in the bipolar, 10 years to get a differential diagnosis. But the other kids never touched it, and I'll never understand why, because they had every reason, if you want to come from a dysfunctional family. I mean, we were the poster child for the dysfunctional family, inasmuch that there was no one home. We were never there. Now, I've told you before that I deal primarily with people in 2nd stage recovery. That's when they leave the treatment centers and they're clean and sober. And I work with them on experiential levels as well as CBT, but primarily I found out through my perspective, this is my perspective now, that, this goes to the study that with the rats that I just read recently. I don't know if you saw it, but I want to talk about that in a minute. However, most of my clientele come from very disruptive homes in one way or another, to a greater or lesser degree. I think it was Bradshaw that said, or Virginia Satir that said 95% of families are dysfunctional. And John Bradshaw said 100% to a greater or lesser extent. So even if you come from a home that is a quality home, good parenting, and good effort bringing up children with everything that you can think, possibly imagine that would be in the best interest of their welfare, you can't have eyes in the back of your head. Nobody can. So, and we have a culture that also really enhances the drug culture. We're up against stress constantly. We're up against, all you have to do is turn on CNN for 20 minutes and you want to vomit. I mean, it's just disgusting what's going on with I grew up in the 50s, which was the last age of innocence. We could go skating at Flamingo Park on Friday night with only the lights on the skating rink. and never have to worry about a mugging, never have to worry about a rape, a kidnap. It didn't exist. Nobody committed suicide in the 50s where I grew up. It didn't exist. So I've lived through the change of Miami, South Florida, when I lived in South Beach and it wasn't the Southern Riviera of the United States. It really sucked. I mean, we were poor. I used to live across the street from Joe's Stone Crabs. I was 6 years old and I watched the limousines pull up and the ladies with their beautiful clothes. And I was wondering, why does anybody want to eat crabs made out of stone? But I was came from a very poor family, didn't have anything, but we were the richest people in the world because we had what money couldn't buy, which was love, basically love. Somehow my kids got that. In spite of the dysfunction. Their father, who was really an addict, gambling addict, somehow managed to love them. He was a good person. He just had a bad habit. So I work a lot on shame reduction, and and I'm going to give everybody a chance to ask questions and make comments. But I want to just mention about the rats and that I had just came down the pike that. They took these rats and they isolated them and gave them the opportunity of having food and water or cocaine, and they did the cocaine. But when they put them in other cages or other, they call them rat packs or rat traps, with other rats, they also they had the cocaine there, but they also had the food. And when they were together interacting with other rats, they did not go to the cocaine. And then they went back to Vietnam and they found out that 20% of the guys that went to the war in Vietnam came back with heroin addiction. And out of the 20% that were really addicted, 95% of them became clean and sober when they went back to their families. And they thought that was really startling. So I want one more announcement or one more thing I have to say. I could go for the whole time also because I work with a lot of recovering people, and I can talk about the dysfunctions in the home, the abuse, the abandonment, the neglect, and I could say, okay, a lot of environmental factors, but then again, my kids should have, by all standards, if that was the measure. So the etiology of all of this is so multifaceted, multiplicity. It's just hard to say what is the cause, nature, nurture, we just don't know. So I just want to also thank Eileen Cohen, who is the Regional Outreach Director for Elements Behavioral Health, and her whole team for making these panel discussions possible. They are right there. It's a conglomerate of treatment centers all over the United States. Dr. Lariche is the medical director here in Lantana for the treatment center Lucida. And if it wasn't for her and her technology, because I'm technically impaired, remember I come from the 50s, I don't know how to do this stuff. They help create these and support these events that Books and Books also to participate in. So are we out of time now with the streaming, the live streaming?
We can make our closing announcements.
I wanted to have the audience.
Oh, sure. Well,
yeah, okay.
All right, folks, so we're going to be signing off for the live stream audience at home, but I want to thank our friend Joan E. Childs for hosting these panels, and please give a hand to our 4 panelists this afternoon for their contribution. Thanks very much. Wow. Did you just...